Welcome back to the LF Press Podcast. Thank you for being here. Hope you're having a good week so far. Milder temperatures, spring absolutely on the way. And hey, daylight saving time. It's nice having a little bit more daylight and it not being dark at 6 o'clock every night. So hope you've been enjoying that. I'm your host, Lynzee Barnett. I am joined today by London Free Press City Council reporter Megan Stacey. Megan, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm loving the sunshine too.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for being here. First of all, I just have to kind of give you a shout out, commend you for some fantastic reporting that has been ongoing for over a week now about a very interesting and important story. So a London homeless shelter has challenged City Council's approval of a 24-story Old East Village apartment tower to a provincial tribunal. This could overturn the council's decision and more broadly set an affordable housing precedent that would thrill anti-poverty advocates and frustrate developers. So we've had a 5-day hearing. There is a lot to unpack here. We're expecting a decision in the coming weeks about what's going to happen, but this story is so fascinating and something that not only people in London should be paying attention to, but in the province, because whatever decision is made is absolutely going to set a precedent. And the housing crisis is real, not only in London, Middlesex, but also Ontario. So let's go back a little bit to council's decision back in 2019 with regards to this building, and we'll kind of set a timeline from there with regards to this 24 building. It's going to be Dundas and Hewitt Streets, Old East Village. Take me through it.
Sure, that sounds great, Lynzee. So it was last year in February that council approved this 24-story tower. They said, "Yep, you got the rezoning, you can build there, actually double what's allowed." And this would be the fourth tower in sort of a complex, right? That city block in Old East Village where Medallion Corp, a Toronto-based developer, already has 3 towers. So they want to put up this fourth. They go through the application process. And it's important to note that the Unity Project expressed all these concerns, when council was debating. So council had this discussion about, is this enough affordable units? How affordable should they be? And they signed off, right? So there was approval for the rezoning, and then this appeal comes, right? So instead of getting shovels in the ground, you've got a challenge to that decision, and it essentially halts the tower, the development, until this appeal is heard. And so fast forward, to this year, we're now more than a year later. It's finally being heard. They actually crammed everything into 4 days. We were expecting a 5-day hearing, but it was 4 days. And, you hear submissions from City Hall, from the developer, and from the Unity Project, all sharing their thoughts on, was this tower and what was approved appropriate? Was it enough? And at the core was really that discussion about the bonus zoning. So, is what Medallion offered to give back to the community, these 13 affordable housing units, and, what they called very good urban design, very impressive urban design for this building, were those public benefits enough to get this higher tower and more dense tower that they wanted to build? So that's the trade-off that council was deciding, and that was the bonus zoning that they approved a year ago. So now we're waiting for that decision from the Ontario Land Tribunal member. And that was Dale Chipman, who heard that this 4-day hearing. It was conducted virtually. And so on the last day, she basically said, going to work through this as quick as I can. She kind of alluded to the mountains of paperwork and evidence that all of these parties were filing. And she said something to the effect of, this decision isn't coming tomorrow, right? These Ontario Land Tribunal members, they go from one hearing right to the next. So most of these decisions, I would say, come in a matter of weeks or months, like usually a month or two. So I think we're probably going to be waiting for a little bit, but hopefully in the coming weeks, we'll have some sort of decision on, where do we go from here? Can Medallion go ahead and build this tower and offer up these 13 affordable housing units? Or is there some other precedent that's going to be set by the Ontario Land Tribunal?
So we talk about 13 affordable units, and in one of your articles that you wrote, which can all be found over at lfpress.com and of course in the pages of the London Free Press, we talk about 7 affordable units as well to get the number up to 20. Where did this kind of come from? Like, there's a lot of numbers that we talk about and the percentage of affordable units out of the total tower and number of units in the building. Where did this number kind of come from?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there are so many numbers. So we're not going to get bogged down by the numbers, but that one's important because it's what the Unity Project's lawyer sort of dropped in her closing statements. She said, if the Ontario Land Tribunal, isn't willing to knock this down, to say, no, that bonus zoning was not appropriate, Unity Project would also love a scenario where Medallion is ordered to provide at least 20 affordable units. So the Unity Project had originally asked for about a quarter of the total units in that tower to be affordable. That would be more like 60. But what their lawyer suggested on the final day of the hearing in her closing statements was, what about 20? You'd have 13 that they already agreed to provide in order to get that bonus zoning and build that very tall tower. And then add another 7 for what the Unity Project and its witnesses argued were already existing units that would naturally have been more affordable because they already existed. They were older, they're not apartment units in a brand new tower, that had been taken down, demolished on that site or related sites, where this new development is proposed and planned by Medallion Corporation. So their suggestion was, yep, keep the 13 that you offered and replace these 7 that were lost, by virtue of the fact that you want to build something new here. And that gets us to a total of 20. So the other parties, City Hall's lawyer and the lawyer representing the developer weren't very pleased with the suggestion, I guess you could say. Everybody agrees that there is a housing crisis in London, but when you're at one of these hearings, there is the focus, and really the central point is planning principles and planning documents, and if I can say, very dry planning rules, right? So they basically told the Ontario Land Tribunal member, you cannot give any weight to that suggestion. We haven't heard anything about 20 units before now. None of the witnesses were asked, is that an appropriate number? Is it better or worse than 13? And so the other party said, no, 20 is not reasonable. We haven't even discussed that until the closing statements here on the final day of the hearing. You can't take that into consideration. But of course, I suppose there's some scenario where the Ontario Land Tribunal member does decide to consider that, but very, very unlikely.
Absolutely. We talk a lot about affordability and affordable housing. What does that actually mean? Because what might be affordable to you may not be affordable to me. It's so circumstantial, right?
I'm so glad you asked that, Lynzee, because to me, that is the central question. And I feel like this gets obscured in our conversations, even in the conversations that happen at City Hall and among city councilors. And some people might not agree with me, but as someone who's reporting on this and sometimes trying to break down those terms, it is very, very confusing. You hear social housing, you hear public housing, you hear affordable housing. And like you said, are we all using the same definition here? So City Hall policies actually define this pretty clearly, and it's based on the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation definition for affordable housing. So the way it's defined, for the purposes of a negotiation with a developer, for example, is affordable housing can have, 2 definitions. One is some housing or, a shelter that's 30% or less of your gross income. And then the separate definition, also valid, at City Hall and in these bonusing conversations, is housing that is at or below London's average market rent. So that's very different than maybe rents that you or I would see if we were trying to rent a place, because those are average, those are asking rents, right? And the average market rent not only takes into account obviously units that are available and the rents that are asked for those units, but also units that are already occupied. And, obviously many of those are much lower because people may have been living in them for a long time, and even for a short time, you can't raise the rent as much, obviously, as when a unit is turning over. So, that is a lower number than what we may be used to seeing. Other services often pump out and tell us what the average asking rent is in London. But for the purposes of this scenario and this negotiation with Medallion, there was a lot of witness testimony from Stephen Justicia about this and about this idea of what is affordable. That rate that was set, he argued for one of these 13 affordable units in the Medallion Tower would have been about $730 a month based on that 80% of average market rent, which is what they had agreed to in order to get that bonus zoning. So that's certainly a lot lower than any unit that you're going to find anywhere in the city right now. But I think a lot of people would still argue that $730 a month is not affordable for someone, for example, who's receiving social assistance or someone who's living on the street right now, that there is not $730 a month, right? The shelter allowance through your Ontario Works or Ontario Disability Support Program is more like $300, $400, maybe $500 a month. So that's still well below, this average rent or what these units would have been rented at. And of course, those folks typically depend on a subsidy or some kind of rent top up in order to actually rent a unit.
Yeah, you hear $730, $830. And as somebody who doesn't have any income or is on social assistance, disability, things like that, those numbers are staggering to hear, especially right now, knowing that there is such a housing crisis. Now, something that I have found super interesting through your reporting on all of this is whose responsibility is this really? Because it kind of seems like Unity Project has absolutely made some valid points with regards to Medallion, but City Council approved all of this. So whose responsibility is it to make some affordable, I'm using air quotations again, units within the city?
Yeah, it's such a good question, Lynzee. And to me, this is really the broader conversation and why we're paying attention to this appeal at all, right? The Unity Project is kind of pushing the envelope, with the development industry, sure, but also with City Hall to say, who's going to step up and get us some more units here? Like 13? Are you kidding? We've got hundreds and hundreds of Londoners who are living on the street, who have nowhere to sleep at night or, sleeping in emergency shelters. So, I think that's really an interesting question. And I think depending on who you ask, different people may have different answers about who should actually be creating or funding or building those units. The answer as to what's happening right now is that City Hall and City Council, I do think, they're trying. There's no doubt about that. There's a new roadmap to 3,000 plan that City Council has endorsed. That's a target to create 3,000 new affordable units in the city by 2026. So that doesn't just mean building new affordable housing. It maybe means supplementing someone's income so that they can afford a rent in a unit that already exists. But it also has a lot of targets about who should be creating those units. Nonprofit housing providers, that's one angle. City Hall actually doing it themselves, that's another angle. And the city is leading construction on a couple modular housing builds. Those are like rapid housing that they can get up quick with prefabricated materials to actually add some new units, affordable units into the market, without needing to depend on anyone else. And then the development community has been asked to contribute some as well, right? So whether that's builders including it in new developments or working with the city or with housing nonprofits to create in another way or create affordable projects in addition to what they're already building. And then I think also, especially from City Council and City Hall, you've got a lot of politicians and bureaucrats putting up their hands to say, how about the province and the feds, right? Like, we really need help here. So there's money flowing both from the province and from the federal government, on all sorts of housing and homelessness programs. But I don't think you'd meet anyone at City Hall who wouldn't agree to, a huge new injection of cash from senior governments to help speed up that process, especially when you've got a City Hall like you do here in London saying, we're now experienced with this, or experience maybe a bit of a stretch, but we're now leading some of these projects ourselves, right? If you can give us the loans, give us the grants, low interest mortgages, whatever it may be, we can add some new affordable housing units to the mix. But I think the ultimate point is you look at the numbers that we're generating. In order to meet this 3,000 target by 2026, you need about 600 new affordable units every single year. And we are not meeting that at all. And the 3,000 target is an ambitious one, but I think when you actually crunch some of those numbers and see where will that get us, it's not as if we're going to be living in some utopia when we add 3,000 units, right? Like the needs are growing, the demand is growing, and wages are not keeping pace at all. So it's really an interesting question. I obviously don't have the answer, but I think there's a number of players here when you ask who really should be building this stuff.
Absolutely. Definitely a bigger issue at hand. No disputing that. Especially, we had 300 homeless folks set up in temporary shelters over the winter months just to kind of combat the frigid weather. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg. So, if you're listening to this right now, what Megan and I have been discussing today really is she goes so much more in depth. There are several articles living over at lfpress.com for you to go read and catch up on. And I would urge you to do that. This is such an important discussion we're having, and a really, really interesting and important precedent about to be set as a result of what we've been seeing so far. So, Megan, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And I hope we have a chance to catch up when a decision comes in. I assume it'll probably be in the coming weeks, could even be a couple of months. As you mentioned, there's a lot of paperwork, a lot of evidence, a lot of stuff to go through. So, thank you for sifting through a lot of this and doing the reporting to make it accessible and easy to digest for the average listener and reader. Really appreciate your time today.
That's so kind. Thank you. I have to say it wasn't as dry as many of those hearings are. So really, really a pleasure to sit through, and such an interesting conversation there as it was here. So thanks.
Well, we appreciate it. If you are enjoying this podcast and you haven't hit subscribe yet, I don't know what you're waiting for. You'll get notified every time that there is a new episode, and they come out every single Thursday. So make sure you hit subscribe, and we'll be back next Thursday with another edition of the LF Press Podcast. Until then, stay well.